The final risk here is that depending on your source, you might end up damaging some of your other objects and implements, equipment in the environment that you're trying to disinfect.
Are there any other drawbacks, risks associated with this type of UV disinfection?
Yeah, the first one is the safety issue. I think the other that's kind of a bit of a risk right now is that because of this kind of rapid rise in UV technology adoption, there have been some bad actors who've kind of entered the marketplace selling bad equipment. And it is tricky when you think about it. Like, we're using something that is not visible to our eyes to kill something that is also not visible to our eyes. And that presents to us a little bit of a bit of a challenge for someone who is, say, in a consumer level that doesn't have the ability to just do the testing themselves and verify that stuff is working the way that they think, or they don't have radiometers to see, oh, well, this is actually emitting real UV light. We've seen, for instance, these UV wands that you sometimes see even sold at like Walmart and Target and whatnot. And it's funny because sometimes you'll look at them and like, oh, I turn it on and it's showing these little blue lights. Well, if it's emitting UV, it wouldn't be showing that kind of blue light from an LED. It won't be showing anything at all. The UV is not visible. So maybe it's a signal light, that's fine, but how do you know that you're actually getting something good out of that? So it's important to be able to verify that the company you're buying from is actually reputable and that you actually have test data and whatnot in order to verify that you're actually doing what you say you're doing with it.
And a successful UVC disinfection system does have some risks that can be damaging to your eyes,
Yep.
to your skin.
Oh yeah, and there's actually kind of one other risk too that makes the biggest difference probably in the hospital environment, because one thing we are doing when we're emitting a lot of UV into our environment is that different sources have different like emission profiles, if you will. They're emitting that UV light the UVC light in that 250 to 280 nanometer range that is the most efficacious portion against germs. But some sources are not always as good as others. And in particular, the so-called mercury bulbs or the pulse xenon bulbs, they emit light also in the regular kind of, like, we'll say what we normally experience as the UV spectrum, the UV, what we call A and B range, that 300 to 400 nanometer range.
Full spectrum.
Yes, broader spectrum stuff. And that has a different effect on materials involved too. So that's the kind of the final risk here, is that depending on your source, you might end up damaging some of your other objects and implements and equipment in the environment that you're trying to disinfect.
Well, that's important. I want to come back to that, but I want to talk about some of the other potential limitations. UV, even though it's not visible, it is light, which would imply to me that it's subject to shadowing. So, for example, in a whole room UV robot disinfection scenario, is that an issue? Is that type of solution subject to shadowing, and what effect does that have?
Yeah, so in whole room disinfection in particular, shadowing is perhaps the number one issue. And the way you try to mitigate that is by either moving the device around or perhaps just emitting just a ton of light so that even the stuff that's reflected around can still have an effect. But the fact is that if you have something blocking the transmission of light through an area, well, that results in a shadow. If you have a shadow, you're not getting as much light there. And that means you're not getting as good of a dose, which means that you're not going to get as good of a disinfection.